we have 2013 Dodge Caravan here, and it needs a transmission. Imagine that, needs a transmission. So this customer was driving along down the highway heading home, and the transmission decided to go into neutral because it broke on the inside. I did make a short. If you want to check that out, go head over there. I got the piece that was broken inside the pan, but we need to get to changing this thing. So first thing we got to do here, we're going to do a bunch of work up top, get all the stuff out that we can, and then we'll lift it up, get the wheels off of it, and start going on underneath. So I've already got this cover off, engine cover. We're going to take the battery out. I'm going to take start unplugging a bunch of stuff and taking the tranny cooler lines off. So get to doing that. And we got a used transmission that we're going to be putting in it. This one came from the wrecking yard. These transmissions are known for going bad. They are kind of crap, but is what it is. I think transmission will probably run you like between $500 to $1,000 depending where you go for a used one. And I think a reman from Chrysler is like 2,300 bucks. I could be wrong on that. That's Canadian pricing, by the way. So I don't know how many miles this thing has on it or how many kilometers, but it was tested and it worked. Went through all gears and has reverse, so that's good. Some of the tools you're going to need for the job, you're going to need a transmission jack for sure. This is something that you want to do on the hoist. I couldn't imagine taking one of these out on the ground, just be like a pain. Another thing besides the transmission jack is there is a special service tool from Chrysler that sits on, I think it's like the strut towers and here, and it's an engine support brace that holds the engine up, because when we take that transmission off, now we're losing where the mount goes, and there's a brace, a frame piece that sits underneath the engine, and all that stuff's got to come out of the way. So now the engine needs to be supported, otherwise it's just going to fall over, right? So we can't have that. But what I used to use at Chrysler was a tripod style adjustable jack. It looks kind of like the tranny jack, except it's got like a corkscrew style adjustment rod. It's like a threaded rod. So you can stick that under the engine, and then it had a handle where you could just spin it to lower down the engine to tip it and then take the transmission off. So I sort of got to figure out a way to do that, because I don't have one of those now that I'm working at an independent shop, but I was thinking of maybe somehow using the engine crane somehow. So I'll cross that bridge when I get there. Okay, so we have the battery out now. We just take two 10mm nuts, loosen those off, get those out of the way. Then there's a battery blanket cover that you take off. Yours may be missing. And then we need to get this tray out. So in order to do that, we've got a 13mm nut, another bolt that goes over here, and one down here. Now there's a bracket on this cooler line that we need to move out of the way, and also a bunch of harness retention clips that look like this. So go ahead and pop those off. There's a couple here, one back here, and a couple along the side. Once we get that out of the way, you may have to fight this harness. It was stuck to it, but once we get that out of the way, now we have access to be able to take these cooler lines off. I'm going to show you how to do that in a second, but we can just start unplugging sensors and anything that's going to be attached to the transmission that we need to get out of the way. Looks like there's a vacuum pump right there that needs to get out of the way so that we can, this guy here, so that we can access the bolts for the bell housing that bolt the transmission to the engine. Right, take 39. So we need to take off these retention clips here. Now just watch that they don't spring out on you. But what you got to do is reach in there with a pick. And I have another video that I just released not long ago on how to change these cooler lines. There's a really good video on how to get these out. But you take a pick and you can just sort of hook in behind and get this clip started to pop out. Just watch that it doesn't fly off on you, because these things like to take off and leave the chat. So we get that thing off, save that, make sure it doesn't get lost. And then all we can do is just manipulate this thing out of here. Just like that. We do the same thing on this one. Now for the vacuum pump, just one clip to unplug that thing. And it looks like we got 13mm nuts. There's two of them to get this pump off. And once we get that thing out of the way, we can take this shifter cable off. Now, in order to get it off, there's a big metal bracket thing, this big spike. So what we got to do is pull that thing out, and then there's 2 tabs on the side of this shifter cable that need to get pressed in, and the shifter cable needs to slide back through the bracket so that it can come out. But before we do that, we need to disengage it off of the transmission shift shaft. So I'm just gonna grab a little flathead screwdriver, and it's just pressed on there. You can just give it a little pry, and usually it'll pop off. Just be careful, because these things are made out of plastic, right? So just like that, we can see we got it popped off now. Now we just got to press those 2 tabs. So I'm going to grab my new snap-on needle nose pliers that are adjustable, and I'll be able to open them up to the widest width. I should be able to sneak in there. I don't know if you can see that. And once we get this pushed back, it'll just slip up and out just like that. Now we can tuck this shifter cable up out of the way. We do not want that attached to the transmission, do we? So now, like I say, these little caps come off, and that's going to let you access those clips. So I'm going to get this other one off, and then I'm going to get this vacuum pump off. We'll get those lines out and move them up and out of the way. Basically, our goal here is just to get everything out of the way. There you can see I got that started. Sorry, my fingers are sort of in the way. Now these cooler lines like to leak a lot. They are known to leak. They're just a rubber line that's crimped onto a steel portion. So if you want to change them, now's the time. You can see how greasy they are. They've been slowly leaking. So we just stuff those out of the way over there, and get these harnesses sort of out of the way. They're cool. We got 1 tab that we got to take off there. So we'll get our trim tool there, and we'll work on getting that vacuum pump out. All right, so we got the vacuum pump off now. So it sits in there like this. You're going to take 2 nuts off. Those are 13mm nuts. And that's going to let you take a ground cable off and also a bracket for this harness. And then behind those, once you get those off, there's 2 15mm bolts that go into the bell housing of the, through the bell housing into the engine block. So that mounts this thing in there. You can get that out of the way and set it aside. And then I'm just going to take this cable off here, or this wiring harness. This is for the actual solenoid pack on inside of the transmission that runs the transmission. So there's a little tab right here that you got to push down on, and then you can push forwards on this gray harness retaining clip. And then what I like to do is just, with these ones, I just give them a bit of a shake and a wiggle while I'm pushing forwards on this gray clip, because you can see down inside of here, there's that little plastic dowel that this whole thing pivots on, and they get stuck, and if you just push it forward and force it, it snaps that off, and then it doesn't secure right when you go to put it back together. So just be careful with those. Now we got those off, we're pretty well almost done up here. Obviously we have a motor mount and stuff to take off, but we'll get to that in a bit. There's also a rear mount down there that needs to come off. It gets bolted onto the differential assembly that's part of the transmission. And I think that's about it for right now. I'm going to go home, call it a night, and we'll come back tomorrow. All right, so we need to get this brace out of the way underneath the vehicle. Now, we got 3 bolts in the back. Those are all 16mm. Then there's a bolt that goes through this motor mount. So you're gonna come over to the passenger side. The head will be here. It's a 15mm. And this bolt here, it's an 18, it's a big one, but it goes up inside of this channel here, this front structure portion. And there's a cage nut that's inside of there. And these like to jam up. This one jammed up on me almost. So I've ran into that before where they get stuck, the threads get all screwed, and then it just becomes a real pain to have to deal with that. So I'm just gonna take these two bolts out here. They are also a 16 millimeter. Remove this engine mount, and what I'm gonna do is swing this whole arm around over to the side and just keep it out of the way. And then I can swing it back, tighten everything back up when I get the new tranny in. Once we get that off, we need to pop this little cover off right here. And we need to undo all of our flex plate bolts. All right, so I took this motor mount that was off of here. Big aluminum piece, there's 3 bolts, one here, one over here, and then one up top. And they're all the same size, they're 16 millimeter bolts. Take those 3 out, and I guess now we'll do the torque converter. Okay, so we gotta take this shield off here that sits up in beside the crankshaft. And the reason we want to do that is so that we can spin the engine over to access those flywheel or torque converter flex plate bolts. So we got one 10 millimeter, you can see that one snapped off. And then there's another hole over here on the other side. So we got 2 10 millimeter bolts we gotta take off. And then we also have some Christmas tree clips. You can see this one snapped off. It just goes through that hole. And then there's another one that goes through one of these holes along that rail. Right in there, and that one snapped off too. So get that thing out of the road. Now we can looks like we're going to use a 24 millimeter socket by the looks of things. You can put a big bar on there and crank this thing over so that we can spin this plate around to access the bolts. And it looks like they're 18 millimeters. I'll tell you in a minute. Yeah, sorry, so it's 27 millimeter socket for the crank bolt, and it is an 18 millimeter socket to get those bolts out there for the flex plate. So go ahead and spin those out. I believe there's 6 of them. Once we get all those out, then we can start to take this back mount off. I believe that's the next step. All right, so I was wrong. It was actually only 4 bolts that were in the torque converter. You can see there. 4 bolts. Now, before I was saying that I was going to undo this mount up here, but I think before I do that, I'm going to pull the axles. So I'm going to get the tires off. I'm going to pull some of probably the tie rod end and these 2 bolts on the strut so that I can get the knuckle over. And then I'm going to pop these axles out. I'm going to take them right out. And then I think we're ready to start doing mounts and bell housing bolts. Okay, so we're gonna take a bunch of things off here so that we can get the axles out. What we're gonna do, you're gonna get the wheel off. I take the brake caliper off and hang it up. If your brake pads are free, I would take those out so they don't fall off. I put a couple nuts on here so the rotor stays put onto the hub. And then I clean and lube the studs for the 2 bolts that hold the knuckle to the strut. Now these bolts are splined at the end, so you have to take the nut off and then hammer these things out. Once I get that stuff off, I'm going to take the tie rod end nut and take the outer tie rod end off of the knuckle. And also don't forget to undo your ABS harness. We want as much slack in there as possible because we're gonna have this knuckle right far down. And then we're gonna take our axle nut off, and then that should separate everything to allow us to remove or tilt the knuckle down and get the axle out. And then once it's out of the knuckle, then we can go ahead and drive that axle out of the transmission. And we're gonna do the same on the other side, except there's a carrier bearing for the intermediate shaft, and I'll show you what we gotta do on that side. All right, so run down on the bolt sizes. So the bolts that hold the knuckle to the strut, those are gonna be 21 millimeter, those nuts and those bolts. This is a 32 millimeter axle nut. And this is an 18 millimeter tie rod end nut. And then of course caliper bolts are 13 millimeter. Now once we get everything off, we can just pull it down. I did use an air hammer to drive the axle out of the hub because they get really rusty. So just wipe my camera off there, that's better. Once we get that out and repeat the same on the other side, we're ready to pop this axle out. Like I say, there's a hanger bearing on the other axle on the driver's side. So what we're gonna do is just stick a pry bar underneath in behind that axle and pop it out. So you can see here, this is where it's gonna go into the transmission. You can see the mark from the pry bar. You just slip it right in there behind between the case and the axle and just pop it out. You can see we've got some room to get in there with the pry bar right in here. So you just stick her in there and pop it out, and just watch, you're holding on to it while you do that so that it doesn't fall off and hit the floor or hit yourself. All right, so I take the 3 bolts out on this axle. There's a carrier bearing right there. You can see like the housing, this guy right here. Now, you can access the 2 bolts from underneath if you come up and around the axle shaft. And then the top one, I actually just go in through the subframe portion, right in, you can see where my flashlight is. I just go right in through there with a couple long extensions. And then just watch though when you're hammering this thing out, because we got to hammer the axle out this way, right? So what you got to do is this whole housing, let's see if I get my hand in there, you have to tilt it back, because you see that sensor that's right there? If it's all the way this way and you try to run it forwards, it's gonna break that sensor and it's gonna run into this bracket right here. So we gotta tilt it back like this, bend this shield a little bit up so that we can sneak past it, and then drive the driver's side axle shaft assembly. The whole thing is gonna come out. So now that we have the axles out, we pretty much, we got 3 things left. We got the mount that mounts the transmission to the body, and we've got the mount in the back that mounts the transmission to the frame, and then also all the bell housing bolts. So what I'm gonna do, and there's many different ways you can do this, I'm gonna take out these bottom bolts here. There's 4 of them, and that way when I have the tranny jack sitting on there, I don't have to worry about the tranny jack being in the way for those bolts. It'll stay in place. Just removing those 4 bolts. There's still lots of bolts left that's gonna hold it together. And then I'm gonna lower the van down and then get it underneath the tranny jack. I'm gonna get underneath it here, undo that mount, and I'll probably get a ladder and get up top and undo the other mount that's on the very top, and take out the bolts on the top. All right, so I got the tranny jack in position, just actually started removing all the bolts. You can see they're all the same size except for 2. The 2 longer ones are your starter bolts. So I'm just going through, I actually just left the starter in position, not gonna take it out. And working my way around, I got all the bolts out right around up to the top. And there might be some still at the top. And then as far as down here, looks like we got 1 more. There's another one up there you can see. And so I'm gonna take that out, and then I'm gonna take, once I get that bolt out, I'm gonna go ahead and take this mount off back here. See if I can show you. So this mount here, there's just bolts at the very top, and I'm guessing they're 18 mil. Oh, by the way, all the bolts that hold the bell housing on are 15 mil. So I'm just gonna undo those 3 bolts or 4 bolts that are on the top right there, and then I'm going to grab a ladder, I guess, and we'll go up and take the mounts in behind the fender there. Okay, so we got a little support that I had to build here. Normally I use a stand that has a corkscrew style adjuster. It's a big stand, but I don't have one of those anymore at this shop that I started working at. So I used the engine jack, fabricated this little mount thing that bolts to the engine stand. It's holding the engine up right now, otherwise it'd be hanging down. So we needed to do this so that I could use the tranny jack underneath the transmission, lower the whole assembly down, and then take the transmission out this side, right? Now, to pick up where I left off, there's a couple things I got to go over. There are 2 connectors here that they're speed sensors. They sit on the back of the transmission. You got to unplug those along with a couple of these Christmas tree clips. Make sure that I just went over the harness to make sure I got everything off. That's all good to go. Like I say, there's 4 bolts in the back of this. This is the rear mount that bolts to the transmission. And then you've got this mount up here that has 2 bolts. They are, I believe they're either 21 mil or 18 mil. And then these ones are all 16 mil. No, 18. These ones are 18. All 4 of them. They're big black ones. And then all the bolts that go around the bell housing are all 15 millimeter. Like I say, they're all the same length except for the 2 starter bolts. And then there are 3 bolts in the top that have studs sticking out of the ends of them. 2 will be on that vacuum pump that we took off in the beginning, and 1 will be on the back that this gray piece of plastic slides onto. So once you get all your bolts out and everything, and the transmission jack's underneath of there, it's a bit of a fight because the dowel pins are going to be stuck into the block. I'll show you here. You can see these guys get stuck in the block and they're just a real pain. That's the next thing we need to pay attention to as well, is sometimes these get stuck in the block when we take them off, take the transmission off. And then sometimes the new transmission will come with dowel pins already in it. And you get it all up there and you're fighting to try to get it in, and you got dowel pins on both sides, they don't go together. So pay attention to that. I've been burned by that before. So yeah, there's a dowel pin. Doesn't look like there's one on that side. Oh yeah, there's one there. This is the back one. Yeah, this back one put up a fight trying to get this off. Now, sandwiched between this transmission and engine is this spacer ring. This is a sort of a stupid design. I hate this thing. It gets all deformed and bent. And what can happen is if you get this thing right bent out of shape and you install it again, if it's mangled, it'll run into the starter where the starter motor comes through. And it can rub on the flywheel in there because the teeth are very close, or to the flex plate, I guess, because it's on automatic, same thing. But the reason, I was doing some reading on this, like why they even have this, it's so stupid, but it's just a shim for the starter so that the starter engages properly with the flex plate, supposedly. It keeps the transmission and the torque converter spaced apart properly. That's all the information I could really find on it. Yeah, I don't know why they even have this spacer here. Why wouldn't they just make the transmission the right depth and not have this? Because this is a real pain to deal with. You stick it on the dowel pins usually. I set them on the transmission or the engine, whatever. And yeah, it's a real pain. Like you can see, I guess it goes this way maybe. Nope. Yeah, it doesn't even want to, maybe I have that on there wrong. It looks like I got it on there right. Unless it goes, anyhow, we'll figure it out when we get there. Yeah, so the next step is to assess our new used transmission. If you got a reman transmission, you're golden, you're good to go. You can slap it back in there. But I got this one from the wrecking yard, so it's seen lots of miles. First thing I do is check out the pans, because I like to make the best out of one, right? So this pan is nice and clean. This dipstick tube is nice and clean. And the other pan is nicer than the one that's on there. It does have a bit of rust, but it is nicer. So now there are serial numbers and all that stuff on there, but whatever. I'm probably just going to clean them up and stick them on. Now would be the time to put seals in there. If you had seals for the differential assembly that's part of the transmission, and because it's super easy to get to, obviously. But this one's just going to get cleaned up and sent in there because we're doing it on a budget, so got to make it work. One other thing I want to show you I did sort of mention this before, but I just wanted to mention it again. Let me grab my light and show you. But in here, there's a sensor on the back of the engine block. And when you're taking the passenger side axle out, you really got to watch. So this sensor right here, when there's a bracket that holds the support bearing for the intermediate axle shaft. And when you're driving the axle out and the shaft's coming out, that whole housing assembly that holds that bearing will run into this sensor. And if you're not paying attention and you don't tilt it backwards, it will break that sensor off. I almost broke it off, so luckily we didn't do that though. So pretty much ready to get this transmission off. I'm going to lift up this other one and set it on here, I guess. Actually, I'll probably just lift it up, swap pans over, get it all prepped up, cleaned up, ready to go. Just make sure everything's cool. And then we'll get it in there and we'll change the fluid once it's in. So let's get started. All right, so we've got everything set up, ready to go. I made sure that our axle seals were nice and clean, and then I inspected them, make sure they're all right, that everything's transferred over. You see there's a bracket that's sitting on there for the shifter cable, stuff like that. Now that needs to get transferred over yet, but I'll do that after. But things like that, because once it goes in, it's in, right? So make sure you're paying attention to what's going on. Also, I got that spacer ring on the block there. It's transferred over, and I just had to hammer it and make it as flat as I could get it and get it back into shape. So along with those, I have transferred over the dowel pins. Like I say, double check to make sure that you've taken the ones out from either the transmission that you took off and also the transmission that you're putting in, because you don't want to get it up there and fight with this thing, only find out that you left one in and there's also two in the block and it's not going together. So I did take off the pans and stuff, and I didn't want to get into cleaning and siliconing stuff tonight, but there really wasn't too much of a difference. I thought these ones were going to be a whole lot cleaner, but they're really not. We did just, I cut apart the filter that came out of that thing because I was curious to see what it looked like on the inside. So there you go. You can see how much stuff that it's caught. Lots of chunks of teeth. So like I say, I think that's out of the off the casing. So basically you're just going to scoot this thing under right now and try to get her lined up here. Trying to remember exactly which way we came out. Got to watch the torque converter doesn't slide out of this thing. That's another thing you got to watch for. So. Yeah. Now, normally you would chain or strap this thing down, but I'm taking a chance. So we get this thing all situated in here. And then we'll start to take it up. Now, the engine's going to be tilted down on an angle so that we could take the transmission out, and we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to match the angle of the jack with the transmission on it so that they're meeting and they go together nicely and they're not like this or like that. So it's just a finicky thing. You got to get it up there and then make sure that stupid spacer thing's not falling off or out of shape or whatever. So start jacking this thing up. I just need okay, so let's run over the stuff that we have tightened up. Basically got the transmission in there, right? We wiggled it into place, and basically what I do is just get it sort of right where it needs to be, and then start a couple bolts, even if it's not perfectly together yet. Get some bolts started, and that's going to line up the position of the bell housing of the transmission and the block. And it's really going to help you get it put together. And then I just started tightening them down. I went around and tightened more than half of the bell housing bolts, and then went up on the ladder and tightened up the driver's side engine or transmission mount. There is two 16 millimeter bolts and then two 18 millimeter bolts. I also attached the lower section of that mount to the transmission. There's a bit of a trick to getting that on and off. You have to have the transmission down in order to access the 3 bolts for the mount that's up there. I don't know if we'll be able to see it. It's an aluminum mount, but it sits right up in here, and the bolts have to come out this way, right? But of course they're right up against the body, so you have to drop the transmission down and take those 3 bolts out, and then there's a 4th bolt that comes in from the top. And yeah, once you get those out, you have, like I said, transmission's got to be tilted down. That's going to let you get that off, and same with putting it back on. It's got to be tilted down to get that piece in there. It's half of the mount. Now, once that's all together, your rear mount back here, if you come take a look up here. So this mount right here, there's a big aluminum portion that goes up there with 3 big 18 millimeter bolts, along with 1 more bolt that goes up in the side. This one right there. So get those all tightened down. Once you get those 2 mounts on there and a bunch of the bell housing bolts tight, you can take all your supports out. That's enough to hold all the weight. And then, yeah, then we gotta get everything tightened down. I'm gonna wash this thing off before I fill it all up and stuff, because I want to see if this thing leaks at all. I did notice that 2 of the pan bolts were actually loose. Like this one's like half out. So this pan's going to come off. I'm going to get a filter for it tomorrow and put a filter in it and clean it all up and put fresh fluid in it. Obviously, I want to give this thing the best surviving chance to live a long life, but you never know with these things. So once we get all these bolts tightened in there, next thing I'm going to do is spin this flex plate around. And like I showed you in the beginning, 27 millimeter on the crank, big ratchet or Johnson bar or whatever. Spin the engine over until those line up, and then you can get your bolts started. And one tip for those is don't tighten down the bolts till you get all of them in. So run them down finger tight until it's almost bottomed out, and then spin it around, do the next one until you get all 4 in. Otherwise, if you tighten them down, you may get to the last one and the hole just won't be perfectly lined up. You can't get the bolt started. You got to go back and loose them all off. So basically, after you get everything tightened, you're just going to start buttoning up sensors. Like there's 2 sensors on this side and 1 on top. We still have the tranny cooler lines to plug in, and we still have the axles to put on. Once the axles are in, we can do all the suspension and steering crap, get all the knuckles and stuff put back on. The this axle that goes to the passenger side is the trickiest one. You got to fish it through all this stuff like I showed you in the beginning, and then I still got to deal with this. If your Caravan's very clean, you probably won't have to deal with this, but there's a nut that's inside of this piece of the body, and of course the bolt gets super rusty because there's a bunch of holes that sit right up in there. Actually, there's a hole right where the threads are, so all the water just pools right in on the threads, and this bolt gets super rusty. And then that's already like pretty much seized up on me. I knew it was going to happen, so I didn't take it all the way out, otherwise it usually breaks. So I have to I'm going to get some penetrating fluid, leave it in there overnight, and then hopefully I can get it to go back the other way. Then we can get this all tightened up and installed again. There's a bunch of other stuff that I'm going to do while I'm down here that's not related to this job, but your van may have it as well, and that's these exhaust studs. They get really thin and break. Same with this. And of course the mount in the back. I undo the hanger back here when we drop the transmission down, and it just rots off. It's like everything on these vans, they just rot. So, but may not be the case on your van if you live somewhere that's not rusty. So, but I take that hanger off so when I drop the engine down to get the transmission out, it's not stressing the exhaust too much because it already does flex it a bunch. So, yep, that's basically it. I'm just gonna get everything snugged back up. I'll try to look up some torque specs for you guys that like to torque everything. And we'll go over some fluid specs and stuff like that. Maybe a part number for the filter. We'll put that in the description. And yeah, we'll pick up right after I get all these tightened up. Inverter bolts here. This is a Caravan, but this applies to any vehicle really. When you're tightening these things down or installing them, just hand tighten them until you get all of them in, because if you go ahead and tighten down each one as you're spinning the flex plate around, then what's probably going to happen is the holes will become off center, and when you get to usually the last bolt, the holes on the flex plate and the torque converter don't quite line up, and you usually can't end up getting the bolt to start. So then you've got to go back and loosen off each bolt for that flex plate to be able to shift in front of that torque converter just enough to get the last bolt started. So make sure that you guys are just hand tightening them. One tip that I like to do is to use a paint pen. Once I do get all the bolts in, I will torque them down, and I'll use a paint marker or paint pen to mark the bolts to make sure that they are torqued, and eventually my first one will come around. And yeah. All right, for this front mount, we're gonna install 3 16mm bolts. Once we get, there's one here, one on the top, and one on the other side. Once we get, there it is there. Once we get that in, then we need to install our mount. So you just slide that up in place, install that really long 15mm bolt. Then we can bring our, this bracket here, this support, we can bring it up and install 4 16mm bolts there, followed by 2 16mm bolts into the bottom of the mount, and then tighten up this big 18mm bolt that goes into this lower rad support section. And then once we get that done, we're ready to get our axles put in place. So let's grab those and slide them in. I just moved the ABS harness up and out of the way so that it's out of the way. When you're installing these axles, there is a clip on the end. Okay, this one doesn't have it, but you'll see on the driver's side axle to be a clip. You want the open section on the bottom, and that's just gonna help it stay centered on the shaft for good engagement into the transmission. And then basically once you get it lined up, just be careful when you're lining it up. You don't want to damage the seal. But then you're just gonna grab it and give it a good push forwards. And this axle assembly inside will bottom out and push the shaft into the transmission. like that. So you gotta get it, gotta get this bracket here tilted backwards. And it's got to, you see that shield right there? It's got to slip underneath of that shield, and then once it gets past the shield, then it can go forwards onto the block. Try to get you a better angle. It's a bit of a fight. Yeah, so there you can see the mount back in there. But it's got to, you can see where I bent that shield up so that it basically runs right into this exhaust pipe, and you gotta flip it forwards till it contacts the block. The two bottom bolts, well, they're above the axle shaft, but the axle goes in like this. You can reach around the axle to start the two bottom ones, and then the top one, I end up using an extension and going through here with a long extension and a swivel.